All right, these notes are for Chapter 12, Section 2 for biology. They're over the section about geologic timescale. Your objectives for this section are to recognize the role of index fossils in determining the age of rocks, and then also to identify major intervals in the geologic timescale. Okay, so first thing we need to go through are these index fossils, and we're going to go back to that relative dating from that last section when we were talking about layers of soil. But like I said, we're going to add a whole new little kink to things in this chapter, be a little bit more specific. We're going to combine that relative dating with some absolute dating, with some radiometric dating, carbon-14 and all that, so that we can kind of more accurately judge how old things are. So I start out with the same kind of scenario. I have these different layers of soil, and I find certain fossils in those layers of soil. So I'm going to have fossil A that's found in that top layer and the middle layer. I'm going to find fossil B that's in the middle layer and the bottom layer. And then I'm going to say that I have fossils 1, 2, 3 that are also found in those different layers. Now, the point of this index fossil section here is that if fossil A and fossil B are some very common fossils that we know a lot about and we know how old they happen to be, let's say that A is anywhere between 9 and 14 million years old, and let's say that fossil B is anywhere from 12 to 17 million years old, I can apply some basic logic to get a pretty good idea of how old fossil 1, fossil 2, fossil 3 are. So what you want to do when you're doing this is you want to recognize your index fossils and exactly how old they are and where those limits should fall. So first I'm going to work with fossil A here. It's anywhere from 9 to 14 million years old. Now remember, young should be towards the top and the older should be towards the bottom. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to label those limits. I'm going to put those limits on this picture and recognize that this top of layer 1 here and then the bottom of that second layer, those are my limits as to where I can find A, because I don't find A below that 14 million year old limit. I'm not going to find it above the 9 million year old limit, so I can put labels on those two layers, right, to indicate that. This is 9 million years, and this layer would be 14 million years old, or at least those limits would indicate that in between is somewhere between 9 and 14 million years old. Okay, and then I combine that with my index fossil B. Index fossil B is anywhere from 12 to 17 million years old, and it can be found anywhere between this boundary and that boundary at the bottom. So again, I'm going to go from young to oldest. Young should be, the younger age should be towards the top. So this is going to be my 12 million year boundary, and down here is going to be my 17 million year boundary. And just by following that basic logic, knowing how old A is likely going to be and how old B is, I can actually figure out how relatively how old fossil 1, fossil 2, and fossil 3 are. So for example, if I wanted to know how old fossil 2 is, I can find that out by combining a little bit of information. Fossil 2 is found in that middle layer that has these two boundaries at 12 million years and 14 million years. So it's really easy to assume, and it's safe to assume, that fossil 2 is somewhere between 12 and 14 million years old. And again, I can follow the same kind of logic to figure out how old 1 is and how old 3 is, but I think you can probably figure that out for yourself. Now, there is a whiteboard question on this slide, but obviously I'm not here today for you to work with on that. I would like you to answer that question, but we'll talk about it later in class. So we're actually going to move on to the next part of these notes. That's over the geologic time scale. Now, some basics for the geologic time scale. I'm not really all that interested in you guys memorizing a bunch of different names of eras, periods, epochs, but you should understand the kind of basics as far as the boundaries are concerned. Right? The reason one era ends and a new one begins is because something significant happened at that time. Right? So the boundaries between many of these different time periods, whether it's big or small, and as you can see from what I've given you here, eras are the biggest unit of that time, whereas those epochs or epochs are going to be the smallest unit of time, right? Periods following somewhere in between. So you guys have probably heard of the 3 different eras. You have the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Paleozoic would be really, really old stuff. Paleo actually means ancient. Mesozoic is that middle time, and that's what meso means. Cenozoic is new, it's modern, it's recent time. But when you talk about Mesozoic, that had these periods in it, like the Jurassic period. So you guys would know if you were thinking about that and you have any prior knowledge at all as far as some very popular movies from the 90s are concerned, you would know that during that period there were dinosaurs, so that Mesozoic era was that age of the reptile, right? The Cenozoic era that we live in now is a little bit different. Reptiles aren't the dominant land animal anymore. Now it's mammals. Right? So remember that the boundaries, the reason why we have these different periods, the way we define the end and the start of a new period of time is based off of big changes. Usually it's going to be a mass extinction of some kind. So when the dinosaurs all died out, that marked the end of the Mesozoic era. And then immediately after that, there should be some kind of adaptive radiation again, which is good for whatever things are left behind. They're able to adapt and evolve and become lots of new different species. And so the Cenozoic era begins with this explosion of mammal species that eventually take over as that dominant land animal again. So big things that I would want you guys to know are why those boundaries exist, why we start a whole new period of time, why this era ended and this one began. And it's usually because of some major mass extinction. And then that's always followed by adaptive radiation, and some other species kind of steps in and takes that place that was left behind. So aside from the Jurassic, Triassic, things like that you might actually recognize, there are a few other periods that were kind of important for us. Okay, this geologic time scale can be found in your book on page 344. And there's just one that I would point out, and we'll talk more about this later, but in the Paleozoic era, in that ancient time, there's this period that's called the Carboniferous period that's actually extremely important to us, just from the sense that during that time, a lot of things that had died were preserved in just the right way to turn into the oil and the gas that we're burning in our vehicles right now. So it happens to be pretty important to us in the grand scheme of things. But like I said, we'll talk more about this later. You can work on it in your worksheet. The major eras again, though, I would like you to remember that paleo means old or ancient, right? I would like you to know that Mesozoic, that meso means middle, so it's in between. It would be nice to know that we are currently in that Cenozoic, and that means recent or current if you want to go with that C. Right? But as far as the periods are concerned, there are some that you recognize just because you recognize them, like the Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, because you learned about those when you learned about dinosaurs a long time ago. Again, there are some other important things like the Carboniferous period because that's providing all the fossil fuels that we use today. We're currently in what's called the Quaternary period, and that's going to last for who knows how much longer, because again, as if we reach another mass extinction, that time period is going to end and a whole new one's going to start. Down at the bottom here, you have a prompt for a whiteboard question again. If you'll try and answer that, we'll talk about it later in class. But that's it for this video today.